You are audible. You are audible.
Audible. Go ahead, Kalyan.
Okay. Is there was some disruption? Sorry about it. It's my.
You have to unmute yourself. Kalyan, please unmute yourself. Kalyan.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. R Venkatanathan is trained at the prestigious institutions of national importance in India, IIT Madras and IIM Calcutta. He is a banker by profession and held senior positions, including managing director. He and his family are comfortable in Singapore, according to our Madhu. His wife Aparna addressed our club 7 years ago. She is also from IIM Calcutta. She is an alumnus of IIM Calcutta. Venkat will talk to us this evening about the lives, lifestyles, work styles of Indians who constitute about 500,000 in a country of 6 million population. We know Singapore as an affluent country extraordinary for its cleanliness, for its efficiency and discipline. Venkat will discuss these characteristics of Singapore. Over to our distinguished speaker. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much to all Rotary Southerners. It's a great honor to be a part of your meeting. Just to add that whatever I talk about during this session is essentially based on my experiences here in Singapore over the last 20 plus years. When I first reached out to Mr. Madhu, when he suggested me to be a speaker, I said, what should I talk about? And to my horror, he sent back a 2-page email with about 20 different points which he suggested I could potentially cover during the session. So I'll try my best to touch on most of them. Let me start by talking about the trends in migration of Indians in Singapore. I see broadly 2 phases in the migration of Indians to Singapore. One is which happened over more than 100 years during the colonial times of Singapore, where it was mainly the Tamils. And when I say Tamils, I'm including the migrants into Singapore. Predominantly, they were in the labor class to work in the plantations and the mines of Malaysia. Singapore was part of Malaysia, or Malaya those days, as you know. But in addition to a vast majority of labor class among the Tamils, there were a few Tamils who were very, very distinguished in their contribution to Singapore and in public service. For example, Mr. Rajaratnam, who's one of the senior ministers and pretty much Lee Kuan Yew's right-hand man when Singapore became independent, he wrote the Singapore Pledge, and he was one of the senior ministers for well over 20 years. Singapore has had 2 presidents who are of Indian origin. The more recent one, Mr. S.R. Nathan, who was president, I think, about 15 years ago. And I think, without being parochial, I think I can safely say that Mr. Nathan was one of the most loved presidents that Singapore has had. And let me share 1 or 2 personal anecdotes of mine with Mr. Nathan. I think it was 15 years ago when my wife and daughter and I were in Chennai in December, the usual December holiday family vacation. And we were in a shop in Nungambakam. I think it was Cotton On. And we were happily shopping there. And then suddenly we saw Mr. Nathan together with one of his security staff inside the same shop upstairs. So I, of course, introduced myself, said hello, and we had a nice chat for 10 minutes. And it was not like you were talking to a president of a country. It was like talking to your favorite Chittappa or something. was very, very casual and relaxed. He asked about me, my wife, my daughter, what are you doing, how long you've been there, etc. Another facet of Mr. Nathan's life was he used to go on regular walks, I think almost every day, by the beach in Singapore. And every few yards, he would stop and chat with people, always with a smile on his face. In fact, my father-in-law, whenever he visited Singapore, he used to walk on the beach as well. And he used to stop and chat with Mr. Nathan a few times as well. So extremely approachable and very well loved gentleman was Mr. Nathan. In addition, there have been, to the best of my knowledge, 3 deputy prime ministers over the years who are Indians, and several other ministers as well. In addition, the legal profession in Singapore has had very, very prominent and high profile lawyers of Indian origin. In the business community, the Chettiars have been very prominent as financiers and money lenders in Singapore. I think a lot of them migrated to Singapore after the troubles in Burma in the 40s, I think, when they had to leave Burma in a hurry. In addition to the Chettiars, you do have Sindhi businessmen who are very prominent here, businessmen in real estate, etc. So very, very prominent community. But given the predominance of Tamil migration, it was no surprise that one of the 4 official languages of Singapore when it gained independence is Tamil. So it's nice to see most of the signages in Singapore in all the 4 languages, including in Tamil. There are at least 2 Tamil channels on television. Even though the Tamil news on the Tamil channel here, the number 2 Tamil, it's very different from what you hear on say Sun TV news. Some of the translations that they do of common English phrases is quite incomprehensible to me sometimes, but it's part of the charm, I guess. The second wave of migration is not necessarily from a particular year, but I would say probably from the late 80s onwards, where in addition to the usual migration of people from India in the construction and infrastructure sector, there were a lot of professionals who started coming in to Singapore as Singapore started to grow. I was one of them, and a lot of my classmates and friends from premier institutes in India, chartered accountants, management graduates, engineers, who moved to Singapore from the late 80s. And it really increased in volume in the 90s, and thereafter it kind of telescoped. Finance and banking, major sector where professionals came in at middle management and senior management levels as well, which was a new kind of Indian in Singapore compared to what Singaporeans were used to, traditionally what they thought Indians were like. In addition, in other private sectors as well, there are Indians, professionals in pretty senior positions as well. So much so that even in the public sector now, the head of one of the managing directors of the MAS, Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is the central bank, he's an Indian. The Chief Justice and Attorney General is an Indian. So, we are a very prominent community here in the business and professional life. Another set of Indians who came in is, of course, IT professionals, which started from the late 90s and kind of took off during Y2K and thereafter. Singapore is a hub or a data center, a regional data center for a lot of multinational corporations. There are buildings very near the airport, the Changi airport, where all these data centers and the IT professionals are housed. You go into that area and whether it's the food court there, whether it's the languages that you hear there, it's a mini India over there. You hear all the languages that you can, Indian languages. You have your Indian restaurants in the food court, Sarana Bhavan, Komala's, Komala Villas, the works, all of them are there. So that's a very distinct category of IT professionals that are in Singapore, and they represent fairly large numbers. What this recent migration of professionals has done is it has changed the perception within Singapore about Indians. Now, what do I mean by that? Is it was a relatively new concept for Singaporeans to have Indians as their bosses in reasonably senior positions and making reasonable amounts of money, being able to send their children to international school, being able to drive, own and drive cars here. And I'll come to cars later. We all know cars are very expensive here. So whether it is in the corporate sector where the Singaporeans found it a new phenomenon to find reasonably well qualified and reasonably affluent Indians coming in. With it came a lot of respect. I think the respect had to be earned. And I think over the years, enough Indians have shown that we command the same importance here. Like traditionally, the Caucasians and other foreigners used to have corporate positions of leadership before we started coming here in numbers. Even when it comes to shopping and in restaurants, Indians many decades ago used to have a reputation of being, hard bargainers and not spend too much money, etc., etc. It was very prevalent in Hong Kong during my initial trips over there. All that perception has changed completely. So Indians are very much recognized as an integral part of life here, and that we are contributing to society at senior levels as well. Let me just backtrack a little bit and talk about my first impression of Singapore. I came here first in 1988 for a 1-month training program from my organization. Typically the flight took off, 2 o'clock or something in the night from Bombay. So you arrive here with hardly any sleep and quite jet lagged. The first thing that hits you is the Singapore airport, phenomenally efficient, very clean, very painless process of immigration. So you get out within 10 minutes of getting off the plane. But then you get into we got into our bus to come into town. That drive, and I'm sure a lot of you have been to Singapore, that drive from the airport to the city, I think it's the most beautiful drive among any airport or city in the world. I thought it was the most beautiful drive then, and 30 years later, it still is. I've been to a few airports around the world. Nothing beats that drive. And what it does, it creates that phenomenal first impression for any foreigner or any potential investor or anybody looking to set up business here, or as a multinational company looking to set up operations here. First impressions, we all know, count a lot. I think that's a key part of Singapore's success in growing from virtually nothing when it became independent to a first world nation that it is today. I said before that Tamil is one of the 4 official languages based on historical migration patterns. But over the years, we have pretty much all language associations being represented here. We have Gujarati Association, Punjabi, Sikh Association, Sindhi Association. So it's quite varied in terms of language, even though it was quite funny initially when my wife and I had first come in. My wife's colleagues used to ask her initially, "Oh, you're from India, but you don't speak Tamil?" And she had to say, "No, I don't speak Tamil." "But you speak Hindi, but is it similar to Tamil?" "No, it's got pretty much no connection at all." And I used to be asked by my colleagues as well, how many dialects are there in India? And you might know that in China there are so many dialects. They are called regional dialects, but a lot of them have strong similarities to the main Chinese language, which is Mandarin. So I had to explain to them that there are not dialects, but there are at least, I don't know, 25 different languages, and Each languages have multiple dialects of their own. So that was an eye opener to a lot of them, that there are so many languages other than Tamil in India. Let me talk about living in Singapore, cost of living, etc. It's a very broad topic, but cost of living really depends on the kind of lifestyle that you want to live. In Singapore, there is fantastic public housing that's been built over the years. I think 80% of Singaporeans own their own housing, which is public housing, and that's reasonably priced. Public transport is phenomenal. It's very cheap. So if you live in public housing and you are taking public transport, groceries, day-to-day, items of day-to-day consumption are fairly nominal, fairly cheap, not very expensive. So if you shop at the government-owned supermarkets, it's fairly cheap. So if you are comfortable with that lifestyle, and which is a very good lifestyle as well, it's not really too expensive compared to any other country overseas, or even in the top cities in India. However, a few items make Singapore, by most surveys, I think top 10 cities in the world, most expensive cities in the world. One is property. Property is expensive. Private property is expensive, both from a ownership perspective as well as from rental. But it's still a favored destination for foreigners to buy property in Singapore because of the ease with which you can buy property here and you can sell property here. Defaults, frauds are non-existent. The system by which you buy or sell property is well controlled. You have everything goes through lawyers. Your mortgage, everything is arranged with the help of lawyers, and with minimal hassle. Pretty much sitting at home, you can conduct property transactions over the phone, and maybe just one visit to the lawyer, and you can get things done. So the ease, transparency, and the absence of corruption makes it a favored destination for property. So no surprise that property prices are quite expensive. So car and property, if you own, then that does tend to increase your cost of living quite a bit. And on a lighter note, alcohol is quite expensive as well. Let me give an example. A pint of beer at a decent pub or bar would cost anything between $15 to $20, which is at least twice as much as in most countries. A glass of ordinary table wine would cost $15 to $20 in a decent restaurant. A bottle of decent wine is $40 Singapore dollars, which is about 30 US. Whereas in Italy or in the US, you can get a decent bottle of wine for $15 or €10 or £10. So on a lighter note, that is expensive. But public transport is phenomenal. So especially with rideshare coming in the last few years, a lot of people now who used to think of owning a car now have moved to public transport and rideshare. Some quick numbers. Total population is about 5.96 million. 70% is Singapore citizens and permanent residents, so about 4.2 million. The rest are foreigners, non-residents. The population breakdown among the Singaporeans and residents combined. Chinese origin is about 76%. Malay is 15%. Indians are the third, which is about 7 to 7.5. And this ratio has been kept, it's pretty much been the same over the years. I think the government makes efforts to keep the racial balance according to what it has been over the years. Tourism, no surprise. China is the biggest percentage of tourists here. 18% is China. Indians and Malaysians are about 7% of the tourist population here. The rest being from the rest of Asia, Australia, and so on. So that's it in terms of numbers. There's been a new phenomenon in the last few years of students, children coming in from India to study in Singapore, mainly in the international schools. Not too much in number, but a few. both in the international schools as well as in some of the Singapore universities like the National University of Singapore and Singapore Management University. On the home front, my niece did her undergrad at the NUS here in Singapore, and then she went overseas to the US for her master's. Couple of prominent children who came from India to study at the international school here. Sonam, the actress, she studied at one of the international schools here, I think in grade 11 and 12. And I believe Ajay Devgan and Kajol's daughter also spent a couple of years here in one of the international schools over here. So that's a recent phenomenon, not too much in numbers. I'm not sure these students stay and look for work here. Most of them come here for either high school or undergrad, and after that they are off to US or UK or Australia for higher studies. But it's a new phenomenon over here. There is the concept of national service in Singapore that you might have heard of, whereby sons of either Singapore citizens or Singapore permanent residents compulsorily have to serve 2 years of national service, where you're full-time in the army in a variety of roles over there. There used to be a bit of resistance initially when we moved here in Singapore 20 odd years ago. A lot of people would hesitate to take up permanent residence because they didn't want their sons to go through national service, because essentially it means losing 2 years from your studies. So you're behind by 2 years. I think a lot of us, growing up in India, losing a year or two from studies is considered a bit of a stigma. We want to finish our studies and start working as much as possible. But over the years, I've seen, a lot of my colleagues and friends, they in fact encourage, they welcome the fact that their sons, when they are, I think 17 or 18, enter national service. And they believe it instills a lot of discipline and order and from a life which could otherwise be spoiled by social media and so on and so forth. So national service has ceased to be a stigma among Indians, and Indians have actually started welcoming this process. Moving on to some of the more interesting aspects of life here in Singapore, let me touch upon food. Singapore is a foodie's paradise. The whole country, Singaporeans, everybody lives for food. They don't mind going 20 kilometers to a place where it's the same food item, which could be 50 cents cheaper, but they believe that it's more authentic, etc., etc. Talking about Indian restaurants, when we came here first, most of the restaurants used to be the Komala Vilas type, South Indian vegetarian restaurants, and mainly in the Little India area, and a few North Indian restaurants outside, not too many. One of the so-called national dishes in Singapore, and some of the other dishes are things like nasi lemak, which is like a stew. Chicken rice is one of the national dishes of Singapore, meaning everybody in Singapore has these. One of the so-called Indian dishes, which is a national dish over here, is called roti prata. And prata is spelled P-R-A-T-A, not the spelling that we are used to. So when I came here first, and I used to ask my colleagues, what is this roti prata? It's either a roti or it's a paratha. It can't be roti prata together. He said, no, this is roti prata. So, and I figured that it's basically made from maida, and it's a bit like the kuttu paratha that we have, that we are familiar with in Tamil Nadu. Maida, and the way it's done, it's guaranteed to, just looking at it, it will add 100 points of cholesterol to your body. Just humongous amounts of oil is used to fry it, but obviously it tastes great. So it's a very, very popular Indian item, as it's called, in Singapore. But with the second wave of migration, with so many of us professionals coming in, there is a spate of Indian restaurants across the spectrum, from authentic Indian restaurants and food courts all the way to restaurants in the 5-star hotels. There's I think at least one Michelin-starred Indian restaurants over here. Again, most of these restaurants tend to be the North Indian variety. And whenever I go for a meal with my colleagues or when I take them to an Indian restaurant, almost always the first thing they would order is naan and butter chicken. That used to, rile me a lot, and it still does. So I always have to tell them that there are more things in Indian cuisine outside of naan and butter chicken, and explain to them various items in the menu, and try and take them away from both. I used to tell them, for health reasons, you should not be having butter chicken, but you should be having more healthy stuff. So always leads to very interesting conversations with colleagues over there. What I miss is some of the regional cuisine that one gets in India we take for granted. I worked in Bombay and used to enjoy the Gujarati thali in most places in Bombay. Chennai has some Gujarati thalis I've had there. You don't get a half decent Gujarati thali here, at least not that I've seen so far. Authentic Andhra cuisine, again, no, not really. Bengali cuisine, no. There is one restaurant, but there could be more, and I love Bengali cuisine, having studied in Calcutta for a couple of years. So some of the regional cuisine I do miss, and I try and make up for it before COVID, whenever I used to go back to India, either to Chennai or to Delhi to visit my in-laws. Talking about culture, let me talk about music, art, temples, etc., etc. I think growing up in India till the late 90s, I think we were spoiled for choice when it comes to art and music. Whether it was in Chennai, in IIT Music Club, we had absolutely the best, the top-notch artists coming in, both Carnatic and Hindustani music, the best people there, the legends. In Bombay, between NCPA and all other associations there. So we were spoiled for choice, I think. And when we came to Singapore, there were initially a couple of concerts that we went to by a couple of legends. Deliberately I'm not taking the name. And I found that they were not serious in their approach to the concert. For whatever reason, I do not know. So what they played was, kind of playing to the gallery, and the last 15-20 minutes of a 2-hour concert would be the typical kind of sound gymnastics that we would see in a concert at the end, where all the percussion, the mridangam and everybody, just joins together in a cacophony of noise. So it tended to be that. So we pretty much stopped going to any live concert of any well-known musicians. However, there are a lot of musicians of maybe the next tier who do come in regularly, and they perform in smaller bitucks of 30, 40, 50 people, or in a much smaller theater. And those tend to be really good because they are very serious and they try harder. So I'm very loath to go to any concert of a so-called legend or a very prominent musician over here. If I need to listen to them, just get back to my CDs or YouTube or whatever and listen to them at their best. There is a Singapore Indian Fine Arts Society, which is very, very, very active. They train, they do degree courses in art, in painting, in music. In fact, one of my wife's close friends, another IIM alumnus, her son recently completed his undergrad in fine art in the SIFA, Singapore Indian Fine Arts Society. So there's a lot of arts and so on that happens here. Temples, there are so many. The oldest temple here is, I think, the Mariamman temple, probably 150 years old. And it's bang in the middle of Chinatown. It's not in Little India. In fact, a lot of the very, very prominent temples are not in the Little India, even though Little India has at least 3 or 4 temples. The Perumal temple is there, and an Amman Koil is there. There is a Dandayudapani temple, which is outside, which is pretty close to the business district, which is a very important temple here because Thaipusam is a big deal in Singapore. More than, in terms of the impact an Indian festival has in Singapore, more than Deepavali or Pongal, Thaipusam has a greater impact because there is a procession which is taken from the temple into the city, lasts an hour or two, where people with kavadis, the full paraphernalia of kavadi dancers are there. So Thaipusam is a well-known festival here in Singapore, which was news to me because in India, even in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, Thaipusam was not so much. It was more Pongal and Deepavali and so on. Another very prominent temple outside Little India is Ganesh Temple. In fact, that temple is in a street called Ceylon Road. I think that tells you the story. I think it was built by Tamils, a lot of them from Ceylon as well. In fact, President Nathan has his house a few yards away from the Ganesh Temple. So I used to go there fairly often. And there was a mandatory stop just opposite the temple. It's the Ganesh Vilas. So almost always used to stop there, pick up some pakoda or masala vada, and then bring it back home. So temples are very, very well known in the Singapore community. Let me talk a little bit about one of the items that Mr. Madhu asked me to cover is, how are Indians assimilated? How do Indians get assimilated? Do they make an effort to assimilate into Singapore, or is it two different worlds? I think the recent migrants, the professionals and so on, I think for obvious reasons, your social circle would be professional as well. So I think there could be a greater attempt on the part of us Indian professionals to integrate. But let me speak from personal experience, because this is something which is very close to my heart. I wanted to get to know the local culture, the local communities, the local Singaporeans very much. So through my colleagues, over the years, I kind of made it a point to learn a little bit of Chinese. One of my colleagues, she used to spend a few minutes every day, write notes for me in Chinese. So at least a few basic words of Chinese and sentences I'm familiar with. My daughter, who studied in international school, she studied Chinese as second language throughout school. So I learned formally Chinese for a few lessons from the same teacher that used to teach my daughter. So much so that in the office, I try and start a conversation with most colleagues, just a few words, even though my pronunciation would be way off. But I found that it opened hearts and minds and doors in the office. And a lot of colleagues, when they see me, they in fact start a conversation with a few words, sentences in Chinese, and it just feels very, very, very good. Another place this helps a lot is in shops, in supermarkets. Our favorite supermarket next door where we do our groceries. Over the years, all the staff over there, they recognize me now, and the service levels. Not that service levels were not good before, but just the service levels, go to a different plane altogether. When you have a conversation with them at the checkout counter, or if you need help with something, it just makes a huge difference if you can even speak a few words to them in Chinese. Any shop, any retail outlet, most of the staff there are Chinese, so it just helps tremendously when I'm able to speak in Chinese with them. Another place where a few words of Chinese helps is in taxis. We all know taxi drivers are extremely vocal. They can be quite garrulous once you get them started. So most times, whenever I used to take a taxi, if I find that the driver is Chinese, I would just ask a few questions. Or if he asked me, where do you want to go in English, then I would reply back in Chinese. And then he would just take off in a mixture of Chinese and English. And you get a lot of insights into the local, what the local Singaporeans are thinking of, what's the local gossip, in a variety of topics. So I found that effort on my part really helped a lot in getting myself assimilated more within at least my colleagues and the other community over here. The other area where it helped me a lot in assimilation with my colleagues is when it comes to food. So I used to take every year during major festivals, Deepavali or any others, make it a point to take them for a proper Indian meal at a nice restaurant. And by the same token, they would take me out for during Chinese New Year to a typical Chinese meal. I have taken a lot of my colleagues to Little India for shopping. I mean, not for huge amount of shopping, but during the mango season, they always used to think that mangoes are from Philippines or from Thailand. I used to tell them that the best mangoes are from India, and they said, "Nah, you're kidding me." So I used to take them there, and during the mango season, of course, Alfonso's. But Banganpalli mango happens to be a favorite of mine, so I introduced them to Bangan. I used to bring back a small crate of Banganpalli mangoes back to the office and distribute it over there. And a lot of my colleagues have actually asked me to write the name because pronouncing Banganpalli is a bit of a mouthful for a lot of people. So I used to write out the Banganpalli and give it to them. And a lot of them have actually gone back on their own to Little India to buy Banganpalli mangoes and take back. So between language and food and to a certain extent the Chinese culture, there are a lot of similarities between Chinese culture and Indian culture as well. For example, a lot of the rituals or practices during Chinese New Year is similar to what we do during Pongal or during Deepavali. There is a concept of giving red packets with cash inside during auspicious occasions. So I always used to make it a point during Chinese New Year to hand out red packets with nominal amount of money to various colleagues and staff in supermarkets or the cleaners in the building, etc. A couple of interesting cultural stuff here is the month of August in Singapore is called the Hungry Ghost Month, which is considered inauspicious over there. So you'll find Singaporeans lighting agarbattis outside the homes to ward off evil spirits. So they would not perform marriages or buy property or anything during the Hungry Ghost Month. So I was kind of reminded of the Margary month that we have, where typically marriages don't happen over here. Another interesting concept is there is an annual holiday in Singapore and Hong Kong. It's called a Sweeping the Grave Day. So Singaporeans, I mean Chinese people essentially, would go to the graves of their ancestors and make it a point to clean them, do a small prayer over there. It's a bit like the Pitru Puja that we do, or Shraddham, or Dersam, or whatever. While we have it depending on the relevant day of our ancestors, but for them, all Chinese do it on one single day. So these are things that you share with each other and talk about similarities in various cultures. I think I've taken up a lot of time. Let me just try and close with what I would see as the major advantages of life in Singapore. I mean, the obvious ones are clean and green and so on. I mean, that goes without saying. The best airline in the world is Singapore Airlines. But from a very practical perspective, there is no corruption here. The government is clean. It's extremely efficient. Government services are extremely efficient. I was just blown by my first tax filing year in Singapore when I came here. We all have our own experiences of filing tax back in India. My first tax return here, it took me 3 minutes to file online. And over the years, it has not changed. Less than 5 minutes to file your tax. And that's symptomatic of how most government services work over here. So it's just absolutely hassle-free. Setting up businesses, it's very simple. Setting up your company, you can do it online. I think within 24, 48 hours, your company is registered. So that's why a lot of multinationals and small businesses try to set up companies over here. very important factor which my wife mentioned to me recently, have the best opportunities here in Singapore compared even to India, or definitely compared to Dubai, where we used to live more than 25 years ago, or any of the other countries. You know, she's traveled across multiple countries and on work and business. And in her own words, Singapore has the best work hygiene that women cannot breach. And that's, I think, a very important factor for families or double professionals to move here. And another important point, I mentioned it at the end, but not because it's probably the most important, is racial harmony. Again, I think Singapore, in terms of racial harmony, is the best country in the world. Racial harmony is instilled into Singaporeans right from kindergarten onwards. It is a truly multiracial, cosmopolitan society. Racial harmony is, Singapore prides itself on racial harmony, because in the early days of independence, there were some racial riots, etc., which were stamped out. So no recurrence of that is tolerated. Let me give an example. It just happened a couple of days ago, which we just read about. Apparently, a couple of days ago, there was a couple, an Indian man and his Chinese girlfriend. I think they're walking down Orchard Road, and apparently they were accosted by a Chinese man who kind of racially abused them and said, Chinese people shouldn't mingle with Indians or something to that effect. And the Chinese girl recorded it, and it went up on social media. The Chinese man has been suspended from his job. He's a teacher in one of the universities here. This we just saw in the newspapers this afternoon. He's been suspended within 48 hours of this happening. So racial harmony is taken very, very, very seriously. And the other factor, of course, is Singapore is virtually crime-free. Nothing that impacts us. Everybody follows the rules, especially during periods of COVID. I think Singapore is one of the safest places during this pandemic. Everybody wears masks without exception. Social distancing is maintained, again, without exceptions. Any restaurant or wherever that social distancing is not maintained is fined, license removed. And there were recent cases of, 2 cases of groups of, I think, 10 or 12 people. I think they were Caucasians who got together for a party on a boat or something like that. They were deported. There was a hearing conducted, they were hauled to court, paid a fine, and they were deported. So, this is very important, and especially the importance of this is emphasized even more during times such as COVID. So these, in my mind, would be the main advantages here. If I have to think of a downside to being in Singapore, I really have to rack my brain. And the one thing that comes to my mind is the weather. It's except brief period in December and Jan where it gets a bit cool. It's a bit like Chennai, I would imagine. It's hot and humid all the year round. So if you do want a change in weather, you have no choice but to get onto an international flight. So that I would consider as probably the only factor that I wish was different, but you can't have it all. Let me end on a very personal observation that I had this morning when I went for I do a walk in the morning. So early morning, I was out for about an hour, and walking in the main central area of Singapore, in and around the Orchard area around 6:37 in the morning. And I kid you not, from the time I left home to the time I came back, the entire 1 hour, there was bird song, there was chirping, tweeting of birds that I could hear throughout my 1 hour walk. And this is in the center of the city. And I thought to myself at the end of it, and when I was thinking about this talk, I said, sometimes we tend to take it for granted being in Singapore, but this came to mind today. I said, if I can hear a bird song in the center of town for 1 hour, and hear the Twitter and cheep of birds. This is not a bad place to be. I don't know if it's paradise that Mr. Madhu referred to in his intro and email, but it's a damn good place to be. So let me stop there. I don't know if I've overshot my time. So thank you once again to everyone for the opportunity. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah,